before, but anyway, enough of such things. I am Chris Irons, former Commissioner, Body Corporate Community Management. With me today, as always, Frank Higginson, partner, Hynes Legal. Frank, welcome.
Hello, Chris. Hello, everyone. On this public holiday eve, ECA public holiday eve, even better.
The much delayed ECA public holiday eve for Brisbane, anyway. For the rest of the state, sorry. We deserve it. Look, welcome. As always, you can chuck up your questions and comments live and also afterwards, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. But if your query is a bit more detailed, Frank, a few more curly bits, put it into the link that we have just now posted. That's a much better option for everyone. Today, Frank, one of our, well, they're all favourite topics, let's be honest, but one of our favourite topics, reviewing bylaws. Now, we've done lots of things associated with this one, haven't we? We've
probably drilled down on specifics, haven't we? Pets, short-term letting, smoking, the whole box and dice. But this is I suppose, a piece of work that we do a lot as lawyers in terms of wholesale bylaw reviews. So what we're talking about today is not, I suppose, those individual bits and pieces. And I think, Chris, probably it'll be interesting to try to go back and link all of the previous ones we've done to this webinar, because there's a whole bunch of offshoots. But talking about reviewing bylaws as a whole, as opposed to an individual bylaw issue. So when you've got your CMS and you've got your Schedule C that has all the bylaws in it, where do you start? How do you do it? What do you do?
That's a fantastic question, which we are going to try and answer. I think that's a really good point to make, Frank, because we've talked, as you say, a lot about the specifics, all about, well, yes to that bylaw, no to that bylaw, what bylaws do. We did a whole thing on enforcement of bylaws. This is the actual nuts and bolts process. Okay, what do you do when you actually want to change, have a new bylaw, reword a bylaw? What happens if you've identified that there's a problem with your bylaw and you actually want to change them? What do you actually need to do? Okay, that's what today is all about. In addition to that first link, here's another link for you. So, Frank, this one is the landing page for the Hynes Legal bylaw markup process.
Yep. And I'll go a little bit off script, I suppose, Chris, in terms of the context for this. What we do, if you give us your CMS by that second link, we'll send you a free proposal. I suppose they should be free, but in terms of what invalid bylaws you've got and what bylaws you should have that you don't have. And that's one of the problems with clients that come to us with, here's this bylaw, I want to do this. And it's when, and that bit on its own might or might not be okay, but then there's a whole bunch of other things that they should be looking at as well. So today it's that whole process as opposed to just the piecemeal bit. So that's where you can send us your CMS and we'll tell you what you need to do and fix a price for doing it.
Absolutely.
Simple.
All right, bylaw review. What are the benefits? Well, there's a few, aren't there?
There are, and I think probably the first point is to correct the assumption that because they're registered, they're valid. So this is you think that a document that's in a public government registry is something that's being checked by someone as being right, and that's not the case. So the way a bylaw gets created is that a body corporate, obviously the developer puts them in place to start with, or a body corporate votes in a motion from the committee or from an owner to do whatever it is, to change bylaw 31, create bylaw 36. Yeah. That bylaw itself should be ruled out of order if it's invalid, but this is the danger in this space, is lots of people don't actually know what is invalid or what's not. Yeah. And if it's passed, it's got to be registered within 3 months. So that bylaw then forms part of the CMS. And that's the document that when people want to go and look at their bylaws and say, well, what are our rules? They look at that, they think, well, that's the rule. And it could be completely and utterly invalid. And I suppose a large part of these overall reviews, that's where we start with. People think that what they've got there is right when it's not. And that is a recipe for disaster. Because, Chris, what happens when people try to enforce invalid bylaws?
Well, it will get nowhere. You'll go through 9 months of stuff with the Commissioner's office, only for the adjudicator to rule in the end that it was an invalid bylaw. So that's a huge waste of everyone's time, money, and effort, which leads us, I guess, to the first benefit of a bylaw review, doesn't it, Frank? A bylaw review will, in an ideal world, get you the most up-to-date iteration of bylaws. It should, in an ideal world, reflect how case law has gone, shouldn't it, Frank?
Absolutely. And to me, that's probably, in a sense, been less prescriptive in bylaws than lawyers traditionally like to be. Because where you need to get to is a committee needs to have flexibility around enforcement of bylaws and deciding what's reasonable. So if you've got a really, really, really prescriptive bylaw, pet approvals, mate. How many bylaws have we seen about pet approvals that are a page long, which have all these rules and conditions? If those rules and conditions don't apply to a particular pet or a particular person for a reason, what's the body corporate do about it? You know what I mean? So it's stuff like that
That's right.
that needs to be dealt with.
And it's so I guess the end result out of a bylaw review, it should save you money. So yes, you might spend money in the first instance to get the review, but you'll save a lot more money than what is expended in the first place because you have ensured that you've got up-to-date bylaws. I would also put it to everyone that you'll end up hopefully with a much more harmonious building, because if you go through a bylaw review process, it's transparent, isn't it? Because everyone will know that you're actually doing it. So in the process, people start to get more aware of bylaws, what they mean, how they get enforced, how that actually works at the scheme. So there's a better chance there of harmony. Nobody can say, well, I didn't know. Well, yes, you did, because it was presented to you at a general meeting and you voted or you didn't vote on it. And then in turn, and this is the point I guess I always come back to, you're in the business of enhancing the value of your scheme. So if you've got bylaws which, for example, are not sufficient to address things like the appearance of a scheme, and you've got bylaws which in effect mean that you've got inconsistent appearance at the scheme, that's a detraction from the value of your property. So you can actually stand to lose money if you don't have up-to-date bylaws which regulate how things are physically and in other ways at the scheme. Yeah.
And then you even go to adding in the bylaws that you should have that weren't needed, say, 10 years ago. Nuisance is the prime one. So there's a statutory provision in relation to nuisance, but that is a messier thing to deal with in terms of enforcement than having the right bylaw in relation to nuisance. So that bylaw, which all of the old school bylaws don't have.
That's right. And I guess,
yeah.
Sorry, Frank, I was just going to say, at the end of the day, what a bylaw review does is make sure that the body corporate is compliant, because body corporate must comply with Section 180 of the Act, or Section 180 subsection 3. Yeah,
that's right. You haven't forgotten.
Yeah, gosh, I thought I had there for a minute. This is about what is an invalid bylaw, effectively. We'll just put up a link to that now. It's that, and in fact, if you're going to bookmark anything, I would bookmark that link to Section 180. That
is the golden set of bylaw rules, isn't
it? It is, yeah.
Don't comply with that, all over.
That's right. So those are all of the benefits of a bylaw review. So how does it all happen then? Well, it's not something that is prescribed anywhere in legislation. It's not just a section blah blah of the Act says this is how you must review bylaws. So Frank, can anybody review their bylaws?
Absolutely. People can do it themselves. Yep. Freely and voluntarily and without an issue. And if you've got a Word version of your CMS, which is what you should have from your previous incarnation, and certainly going to be part of the modules now, isn't it, Chris? Everything's electronically handed across.
Yep.
You can change things in that and go for your life. And they can say whatever you want them to say.
That's right. And if you are a Word nerd, this might be heaven on a stick for you for reviewing bylaws. Because you can spend literally hours and hours and hours poring over each word in relation to the meaning of the next phrase, in relation to the next phrase, and the next one, and the next one. So if you are a bush lawyer or an amateur grammar expert, go for it. Happy days indeed. But Frank, you've got a bit of a war story to contribute.
It's a favourite one, and I really like this guy. He's a really good guy. But he was part of the Chairpersons Association in his particular area. So I'll leave it as anonymous as that. And what he did was run around. He wanted to review his bylaws, so he ran around and got copies of everyone's CMSs, consolidated all the things that he wanted into his CMS, and then served up to me and said, "Mate, what do you reckon?" And what he'd gone and done is pulled all of the draconian bylaws from everyone else's CMS and put them in his.
Oh, yes.
So it was literally Stalinist Russia. Because no one's doing anything unless the committee says you can do it.
Yeah.
So, and the starting point for that is that's actually going to be oppressive or unreasonable 90% of the time, which is what it was.
Yeah.
So that's always the danger. And I know, obviously, it's very self-serving for me to sit here and say you should get legal advice for it. And this is, you come back, Chris, to the objects of the Act. It's designed for self-governance, designed for people to be able to look after themselves, but it's bloody complex. And if you incorporate a bylaw that's invalid, and even if we give you advice that said that's invalid, you know it. The body corporate manager today knows it. The resident manager, if you've got one, might know it. But in 3 years' time, when you're not on the committee, body corporate managers moved on, resident managers sold, no one knows. They picked it up and say, oh, you beauty. They can't keep pets. Let's go. And that's invalid. And there's plenty of bylaws. Like we just got a job this week with a note, with a building with an absolute, you cannot keep pets. It's invalid. So the body corporate, in fact, has no rights at all with respect to the regulation of pets on that basis. So it's just those things. So yeah, absolutely you can do it yourself, but are you going to get it right?
And why would you take the risk anyway? I mean, in doing it yourself, you are assuming a certain degree of risk. Now, if you as an individual, or you as a committee want to take that on, go for your life. I just don't know why you would want that responsibility thrust upon you. And particularly if you are going to do so and assume that you are up to date with case law and adjudicators' rulings on different kinds of bylaws, because that of itself is a massive undertaking to assume that you are up to date with that sort of thing. So, bottom line, anybody can review bylaws, but it's very risky to do it without somebody suitably qualified legal advisor doing it. I think that's probably the bottom line we want to make there, Frank.
As always, mate, everyone can act, the person that acts for himself as a fool for a client. Old school. Sorry, everyone. So I suppose then, into what a review actually means. And I think this is where we've taken a bit of a different approach to bylaws, because the traditional way to approach a review of bylaws was to get the CMS, which has got bylaws 1 through to 40. And I suppose the origin of a lot of these things is interesting. So if you go to the back of the BCCM Act, I don't know which schedule, Chris, that would have been a good link. But anyway, but there's 11 bylaws there that are the statutory standard ones that the government's produced. So that's where most of them start, from that 1 to 11, and then everyone's bolted on all of these other things over years. So lawyers being creatures of precedent, someone probably back in the 80s or the late 70s, it would have been 80s when Bugter arrived, came up with what would be a good set of bylaws. And those things have been cut and pasted and repeated ad nauseum over decades, literally decades. And they're not fit for purpose. They're not in the right order. They deal with a whole bunch of things that legislatively shouldn't be in bylaws. And I mean, one of the most common invalid bylaws we see. So if you pull your CMS out and have a look at it, and particularly if you're in a high rise, if there's a bylaw there about the bulk supply of electricity or utilities, that is not something that should be in bylaws. Full stop, end of story. That's got nothing to do with the common property of the body corporate. That's got to do with the body corporate providing services to individual owners, which is a separate arrangement with occupiers. So that sort of thing is the stuff that's in all of these things. So to me, the right way to review bylaws is actually to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because in a sense, there is no baby that's worth keeping. Get rid of it all.
Interesting analogy, Frank.
Yeah, and that's a little bit dangerous, but yeah, start completely afresh and get the bylaws in the right order, in the right sections, with everyone understanding what they're doing. Because it's just
really
extraordinary.
What you're saying, Frank, is that instead of, we always hear the phrase, don't reinvent the wheel. You're actually saying reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what you've got, and the old school way to do it is to amend bylaw 4 by tweaking these words, and let's change tenant to occupier. Let's get rid of executive committee and call it committee. And that's meaningless, because you're not actually dealing with the substance of what should actually be there. And the other thing is, if you do that, you're actually not then looking at what else should be in there. Come back to the nuisance bylaw. Is that in there? If we're in a high rise, have we got a bylaw that deals specifically with hard flooring? Or do we have a bylaw that's way too prescriptive, that doesn't allow for flexibility from a committee perspective? And the hard flooring example is always hard flooring. You can only do X, Y, and Z. But for the person on the ground floor, that shouldn't be the case. It should be the person on the first floor and above that's got to deal with that, because that's where the noise goes down. So it's those sort of things.
That's right. So how does it all start? Well, look, like with anything in life, somebody has to initiate it, don't they? Usually that's the committee, although it doesn't have to be. It can be an owner proposing it themselves. So yeah, committee or owner initiates the process, and the owner does that by either themselves or putting up their own motion, as I say, putting up their own motion or requesting that the committee do it. I think that's something, Frank, that Hynes does for free.
Absolutely. So part of the proposal we send gives you the motion that the committee or the general meeting needs to approve a review of the bylaws itself. So, you know, and I suppose now owners can put motions to committee, because the spending on these things, which is a couple of grand, is almost always within the body corporate committee spending limit. Well and truly capable of being a committee decision.
So somebody initiates it, agreement's reached for the obtaining the quote, and then hopefully the expenditure to do the work. So then the work happens, baby thrown out with bathwater, new set of bylaws or a new CMS, I should say. So that then must go to a general meeting. And as we said, it's not so much that you're registering a new set of bylaws, you're registering a brand new CMS, community management statement, aren't you?
Yep. So you don't do things one off and amend documents. It's a whole new document.
No such thing as an amended CMS. It's always a new CMS. And so then that requires a special resolution, which is effectively 2/3 with a few little nuances, but not always, Frank.
No, if you muck around and change exclusive use bylaws, leaving aside that you need the consent of the person whose exclusive use bylaw you're mucking around with, it requires a resolution without dissent. So those things need to be put in a bubble and not touched. And I suppose one of the things, and we've just done this for a client who they've got a complete bylaw review. They're a new building, developer bylaws that don't really reflect what is largely now an owner-occupied product, so they're getting really specific about some of their things. They've got a group of bylaws that are non-contentious, so they're going through as one special resolution, and then they've got 4 separate issues where they're giving owners same issue choices.
Right.
So here's the choice we're offering in relation to this. Boom, boom. This one, boom, boom. So owners can then make a decision to leave that off completely or go with option A or option B. And so at the end of that general meeting has 5 resolutions to change the bylaws. Most bodies corporate, I suppose, Chris, this is always one of your themes, is testing the temperature of the room.
Absolutely.
What's the vibe?
Well, what's the point of putting a particular, so let's just say your intention in reviewing the bylaws is to include a particular bylaw that for whatever reason you know is going to be very contentious at your building. Is there any point putting forward if you're quite sure that there won't be enough support for it? If you don't think you can achieve 2/3, or if a resolution without dissent is needed, if you don't think you can achieve that, is it worth the time and effort? And we'll talk a little bit about communication around bylaw reviews towards the end of today's webinar, because there's an element that goes with that. But you do need to know what it is that you're dealing with. If everyone's going to be totally on side about the bylaws that you are proposing be addressed in the review, that's great. Have at it, proceed unadulterated. But if you know that there's going to be problems, then you need to start on the communication and the strategic side of things. Like that example you just cited, Frank's a really good one. It's about, obviously, that building knew that there were going to be issues, so they went about it in a particular way. So 2 other points about bylaw reviews that we need to mention. Bylaws do not take effect until they're registered with the Titles Office. So let's just say,
you've got a 3-month window to do it from the day of the general meeting. If you don't do it inside that window, they fall away. That's to give everyone certainty about what is actually in place.
And you need to restart the approval process after that. And remembering also that in that elapsed time period, other things may have happened, which then cast some doubt on the bylaws that you've got. Who knows what orders could be made in that 3-month window, which would actually warrant it being re-reviewed, which is a whole other thing that you don't want. So that's point 1. Point 2, and you said this right at the start, Frank, the Titles Office does not vet bylaws. So whatever they're presented with, they're just going to register.
You pay the fees, the seal's legible, the right exclusive use plans are there, and it's done. They don't read it.
We just want to inject a little discussion point or something for people to have a think about. So when New South Wales reviewed its strata laws, not that long ago now, actually, they introduced a provision that all bylaws had to be reviewed, I think it was in 1 year.
Yeah, it was 12 months, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so basically what the government was saying there was that we acknowledge that there might be some invalid bylaws across the state. Away you go. You've got 12 months in which to review your bylaws to ensure. Now, if we've got any people who are familiar with New South Wales bylaws, feel free to jump in. But that's our general understanding of what happened. Bearing in mind that Queensland's body corporate laws are under review at the moment, and there are several bylaw issues at play in that review, is something like that likely for Queensland? I reckon it's 50-50 at least.
Yeah, we've got a lot of clients that are holding off subject to what happens with, pets and smoking and even short-term letting and all that sort of stuff. So it'll be a really interesting one, because I think from a government perspective, if you're changing the laws to give people choices, you'd want to make sure that they understand that they've got the ability to make that choice. And that is, consider changing your bylaws.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, inside the cone of silence that is that room, we can't comment, but it'd be interesting.
Absolutely. Frank, do you just want to talk a little bit about what Hynes does in the bylaw review process?
Yeah, sure. Sure. Really, Chris, thank you for that invitation. Yeah, so the baby with the bathwater bit is, let's ignore what you've got in terms of bylaws, and let's start with you telling us about your building. So what does your building have in terms of common facilities, specific issues, specific circumstances, and really, and that's back to that example with that developer, the review of those developer bylaws with that client we're doing at the moment. What specific issues are important in your building to the community that we need to take into account? So there's the starting point. So that's the bathwater gone. You tell us what your building looks like. You tell us what your building needs. You tell us now what you understand the issues are. We then put together a set of bylaws that address all of those things. And if, for example, you're telling us that we are pet free and we're always going to be pet free and there's no way to change that, then we'll explain to you why that's not possible. Is the brutal reality of it, because there's always a wish list for clients, and some of the things, and this is back to doing it by yourself, some of the things that you might want to do, you just can't do. So that's just accepting the reality of the situation. So usually that set of bylaws with the proper explanation to go with them, because it's a bit of a almost a user guide in terms of how to enforce these things, because you've got to and understand them. Not that they're legalistic, but they're short and sharp and to the point, which makes it easier for everyone to understand them and know what's going on. Usually, by the time we go through that process, give you the bylaws that address the things your building needs and explain to you how that needs to work. We have very little issue with clients coming back to us asking for further refinement questions or otherwise. So I don't know how many of these we'd do a year, but it's certainly been hundreds in the last couple of years easily. So probably very, very, very down pat process. So, and part of that is some tools you can use to go to your owners if you want to have that explanation. That's the communication piece at the back end. But it's a pretty slick process, if I say so. But it's only because we've seen so many things go wrong. So you work backwards in terms of how do you address that by this? How do you address that by this? So it's not random. I sit here and do it all manually. We've got a very, very good process to do it.
Okay. And we're going to talk about that communications bit sort of in the rest of the webinar. We've just got a couple of questions there before we kick into that. So NOC or NOC, thank you for tuning in. Should bylaws include conditions in the detail, e.g. for hard flooring, or should the conditions be separate and the bylaw just say conditions can be applied? The conditions need to be included in the bylaw for them to have any effect.
To a degree, provided, and this is the difference, provided that the body corporate acts reasonably about what its policy might be. So, and one of the things, for example, that I think is really difficult for a body corporate to enforce is you see hard flooring stuff and you have specific LNTW and FIC ratings, all that sort of stuff inserted in bylaws. Now, just by virtue of the fact you've inserted a rating doesn't make that rating enforceable. So, and I still don't understand what these things are, but maybe a reasonable FIC rating from an Australian standard is 100, but the bylaw refers to 200. So if you've gone and imposed that as something that's unachievable, then that's going to be invalid. So to me, where I get to is sort of having some of the things in there, like, in terms of body corporate, you must come and seek approval of the body corporate before you put in hard flooring. 100% cool. And it's the conditions on which the body corporate grants that approval then become the issue. So I'm a fan of taking those out of the bylaws so that they can be specific for the circumstances.
But if you're talking about are conditions useful, then the answer is definitely yes.
Absolutely they are.
That's a tool by which the committee can properly regulate things, and it shows flexibility, which in turn demonstrates reasonableness. Gleno, regular. Thanks, Gleno. Can an adjudicator order a bylaw review? Yeah, sure, I can. Usually the way it would happen would be let's just say you're an owner, you put up a motion with a quote for a bylaw review and it gets defeated and it's not a reasonable decision, then that would be potentially. But I don't know that so much the adjudicator orders the bylaw review. Typically what happens is that the adjudicator finds a particular bylaw or a portion of a bylaw to be invalid and then orders a new CMS be registered as a result. That's usually what happens. Judith, thanks for tuning in. Does the 3-month period count even when vote challenged to adjudicator and decision over 12 months later? So if the adjudicator makes an order to register a new CMS, then that's the bit that takes effect. I think that's what is being said there, Frank.
Yeah, and they can absolutely, adjudicators can order that. So I suppose to me, you'd almost have a situation if a motion's approved to vary the bylaws, body corporate should act on that and register the CMS. If someone's challenging the validity of something that went on there, they might file their application, and part of their application might include an interim order seeking that the body corporate don't register the CMS. But absent that, they should be. And then other than that, the adjudicator can always order things be unwound.
Yep.
That should be there. Yep.
Les, thanks for tuning in. Frank, ballpark budget for CMS review. Frank, are you willing to give one?
Yeah, $3 and a bit grand, Les.
Thank you.
And we break that down into stages. So there's a sort of a preliminary bit, the bulk of the work, and then so for example, if we did the work and it wasn't approved, you don't need to go through the registration piece. So it's sort of a staged bump along the way. But again, send me your CMS, I'll give you a proposal. Be very fixed in that.
John, as always, thanks for tuning in. How far can you go with nuisance provisions in a CMS, what you can and can't provide for, what you can do to protect a committee adequately from an off-the-rail owner? It's a tough one, John, but generally speaking, you can't go beyond what the Act already requires. So if the Act has already provided for something, a bylaw can't provide for more than that.
No. But what a nuisance bylaw does, though, is give you the ability to take an action in relation to the enforcement of bylaws in relation to something that is nuisance, allegedly nuisance, and then the question is whether it is or not.
That's right. Really quickly, I just want to talk about communication because this is, I think, a really important part of the process. So we alluded to this just before, didn't we, Frank? If you know that a bylaw or a couple of bylaws are going to be tough work to get up at your general meeting, then you need to start thinking about communication. So I think it's fair to say that when you talk about a bylaw review, the default position of a lot of owners is going to be suspicion, and particularly if money's been spent on lawyers. People don't like lawyers. I don't know why, but they don't.
Lovable, cuddly creatures that we are.
Yeah. So, and then especially if the reviewed bylaws, if an owner gets sense that that reviewed bylaw is in some way specific to them, or if a new bylaw has been drafted because it targets them. So you can see what happens then, can't you? They get wind of it, they get their back up, and then they start agitating around the scheme to perhaps not support. So then the bylaws that you've crafted and spent money and time on are in jeopardy of not being approved. So this is where communication becomes a real issue, and you've got to take the temperature of the building and figure out the best way of getting it across. So, I mean, I know you and I, Frank, we're familiar of circumstances where the body corporate has done things like hold an information night or a town hall style forum, which is where they say, okay, we've got this thing coming up and we know that maybe not everybody knows what it's about or thinks it's a bit problematic. Come along and we'll explain it to you. that's actually a really significant step. Not only does it help the body corporate shore up numbers for what it wants, but if there is a challenge to it later in the Commissioner's office, they can actually point to that and say, well,
Becomes very defensible.
We took those steps. So look, and there are some risks with those, of course. There's a risk that you will poke the bear in the process, even more so than where you are, but you need to take that into account. As I said before, there's no point in proceeding with something that's doomed to failure, I would think. And that maybe is something that an independent strata consultant could be involved with. I don't know any of those, but if you did know of any of those, potentially they could assist with that. I think the bottom line here, Frank, is that, and we've got a few more questions there, geez. I think the bottom line here, Frank, is that you need to start. So it's a journey. There's all of these steps. Like any journey, you got to start, don't you?
And that proposal piece, going back to the pitch, is here's the stuff you've got that's wrong. Here's some of the stuff you don't have that you should have.
Yep.
At no cost.
And you've got it. Yes, it might cost money for you to review your bylaws. Yes, it might cost money to do that communications work that we just spoke about. I think our shared view, Frank, is that that is money. Not only is it money well spent, you will save yourself money potentially in the long run.
It's a form of insurance.
So. Yep.
Except you don't have to pay it annually.
I think that's a really good way of thinking of it, Frank. Very quickly, Mr. NB, as always, regular. Can bylaw explicitly reference external land use policy document and thereby make the policy enforceable as policy where it stood at the date of the bylaw registered?
Don't know. I need to see the land use policy itself, because what you come back to that section 180, bylaws can't be oppressive or unreasonable. So is there something in there that is oppressive or unreasonable, or is it imposed by a local government? Is it, so there's a bit of grey about that, mate, to be perfectly honest.
Mandy, thanks for tuning in. We have to amend our bylaws within 3 months to an adjudication order. It would be best to review all the bylaws at this time. Yeah,
absolutely. We'll do it. Yeah, if you're gonna have to do something, do it all.
Yep, take the time if you can, and the money to do it all at once. Wow, that was a big one today. Lots of comments on that one. Look, it's clearly something that people are interested in. Probably don't, as I said, Frank, right at the start, it's probably something that a lot of people hear about but don't actually know what involved by a review. So hopefully today you got an idea of that. One quick final question, Leanne. Can a body corporate scuttle a sale by not allowing a dog? They sure can. Happens.
And they do it a lot, but they nearly need to be put in their spots before that actually is allowed to occur. And we've got a great little business, Belting Bodies Corporates, doing that.
Yeah, so the answer is yes, it can happen, Leanne. Should it? That's another question. Thank you, everyone. We have come well and truly to the end today. Stay tuned for next week's topic. It will always be informative and illuminating.
And it's on my desk to figure out. We've got a range of them, so that's my fault, not Chris's.
It's a shared responsibility, Frank. For everyone who tuned in today, thank you so much for doing so. Again, we really appreciate the effort, and particularly for everyone in Brisbane who's probably already in long weekend mode. Thanks for making the effort. Much appreciated.
Gleno, yes, we do.
Enjoy your long weekend if you're in Brisbane. Enjoy your weekend otherwise, everyone else. And maybe we'll do this all again next week, Frank.
Perhaps.
Yeah. Perhaps.
Well, Melbourne Cup on Tuesday.
Yes, well. No,
there we go.
We'll be back. All right. Thanks, everyone. Much appreciated. Bye.